Here's the Maxwell family, born in Cuba and living in Arkansas during the 1880 census. They were born in Cuba of Scottish ancestry and worked in groceries and dry goods. 1800s American Heartland and Cuban families. We're going to look at some of the Cuban families living in America's Heartland during the 1800s, and we'll look at Arkansas, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. A number of people from Cuba settled in the United States in the 1800s and earlier as well, and this subject is of interest to me due to genealogy research. And folks that have taken a DNA test sometimes discover some Iberian background and wonder how, as there's no connection they can figure. Well, back then, some Americans also worked and lived in Cuba and formed their own families there. Many of them also returned again to the U.S. with their loved ones from the island. So that's one possible answer as to how Spanish ancestry could pop up in some folks' results. Cubans were mainly of Spanish ancestry as well as Portuguese, but some were also fully or in part of British ancestry, likewise French, and from other places, with many being of African ancestry as well. The island was a melting pot to one degree or another, and for a very long time at that. Some people back then, like today, moved around for business, love, or due to wars or a combination of circumstances, but the story is even more complicated than that. If you check out my previous videos on this topic, you'll see why. In any event, the documents we'll look at are publicly available. Arkansas. Edmund Rivet was born in Cuba and living in Arkansas during the 1870 census. He was a laborer. Mary Hardy was born in Cuba in 1815 and was living with her family in Arkansas during the 1860 census. Her husband was a farmer. Peter Castanaro was born in Cuba in 1816 and living in Arkansas during the 1870 census. Elias Barceloin was born in Cuba in 1869 and living in Iowa during the 1880 census. He was a farmer. Emma de Costa was born in Cuba in 1854 and living in Iowa during the 1880 census. She was a seamstress. Her parents were both born in Cuba. Julia Warren was born in Cuba in 1866 and living in Iowa during the 1870 census. She worked in housekeeping. Marion Fargo was born in Cuba in 1842 and lived with her family in Iowa during the 1870 census. Her husband was a farmer as well as some of their children. Anthony Suarez and his family were living in Kansas during the 1880 census. He was born in Cuba in 1837, and his parents were born in Cuba and New York, respectively. In Kansas, he worked as a molder. His wife, Julia, was a housekeeper. She was born in New York, and her parents were also born in New York. Likewise, their son, Edward, was also born in New York. Frank Rodriguez was living in Kansas with a family he worked for as a servant and a shepherd. He was 15 years old during the 1880s census. Frank Rodriguez was born in Cuba. Frida DeVere was born in Cuba in 1870 and was living in Kansas during the 1880 census. At the time she was attending school, her parents were born in Ohio. Paul Kenvack was born in Cuba in 1816 and was living in Kansas with his family during the 1880 census. He was a farmer, and both his parents were born in Cuba. Pedro Rodriguez was born in Cuba in 1835 and was living in Kansas during the 1860 census. He was a miner. Manuel A. Diaz was born in Cuba in 1854 and living in Missouri during the 1880 census. He worked as a civil engineer. Mr. Alvarez was born in 1831 in Cuba, as were his parents. He was a sugar maker in Missouri during the 1880 census. Mr. Hastings was born in Cuba in 1838 and was living in Missouri with his family during the 1880 census. His parents were born in England and in Cuba. He was a farmer. The Aguero family, born in Cuba, were living in Missouri during the 1880 census. They were sugar manufacturers. Here we have two Cuban-born names from the 1870 census in Nebraska. Luis Silva, born in 1846, and John Osorio, born in 1847, both laborers. Caroline Creeler was born in Cuba in 1830 and was living in Nebraska with her family during the 1880 census. Her parents were both born in Cuba. Her husband, Joseph Creeler, was born in Spain, as were his parents. Their son James was born in Florida. William A. Rue was born in Cuba in 1856 and was living in Nebraska during the 1880 census. His parents were both born in Spain. He was a laborer. Anita Greenup was born in Cuba in 1878 and in the 1910 census was living with her family in Oklahoma. Both her parents were born in Cuba and she could speak, read, and write English. Her husband was S.C. Greenup and they had 2 daughters, a son and a niece, in the household. Jack Ociel was born in Cuba in 1867. In the 1910 census, he was living in Oklahoma with his wife, 3 children, and his sister. Jack immigrated to the U.S. in 1888. He spoke English and was a merchant. His wife was born in Brazil in 1874, immigrated to the U.S. in 1901. John Brooks was born in Cuba in 1860 and in the 1910 census was living in Oklahoma and working as a hired hand. He was a farmer and could read and write. His father was born in Virginia and his mother was born in Africa. S.F. de Silva was born in Cuba in 1873. He immigrated to the U.S. in 1882 and was living in Oklahoma in the 1930s census. His parents were born in Spain. He was a physician and could speak English. Walter Raza was born in Cuba in 1840 to Italian parents. He was living in Oklahoma with his family during the 1910 census. He could speak, read, and write English and was the owner of a restaurant. And this is a good example and a good place to end. Cuba was populated mainly by Spaniards, but also other Europeans as well as Africans. And this is a good example of how families moved from location to location throughout the generations. And so, well, that's about it. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll catch you next time.